This is Critical Nonsense, our high-lowbrow show about culture, science, and tech. This week, Joey asks special guest Harmand Ponder about rock and roll, and Harmand asks Joey about the genes of our identity.
Woo! It's a little weird and a little strange when you make your home out on the range, singing, "This is a podcast." This is what a Joey sounds like singing the intro to Hey Dude from the 90s on Nickelodeon, if you're not as old as I am.
Thanks for clarifying. You should do that more often.
And this is what an executive producer in Cattle Hand, Jess Vander, sounds like.
Hi, this is Jess.
I am not a cattle hand.
This is what cattle hand.
A special guest and neurodivergent brethren Harmand Ponder sounds like.
Hello.
Oh, so much richer and sonorous than my voice.
Aaron would say the dulcet tones.
Yeah, the dulcet tones of Harmand Ponder.
So nice.
Am I pronouncing your last name right, Harmand?
You are, yeah. It's English, so yeah.
Oh.
There you go.
Straight up.
Jess, what is your icebreaker?
Oh, I have a question. Does sparkling, spicy water sound good? Like chili, spicy something, but sparkling water. Does that sound like a good combination?
I call any carbonated water spicy water anyways. So, but I think if you had like a citrus plus like a spice, that would be, I think the spice by itself might be like, a lot of spicy flavors are a little bit like acrid when they're by themselves, right? Like a roasted pepper is like a little bit burnt kind of flavor, but if you had it with something that was a little brighter, it might be quite like a lemon or a lime chili sparkling water. I would be down with that. I would certainly try it.
What say you, Harmand?
I agree with Joey. I think like I once had a lemonade with like cayenne or something in it, and it was like a spicy lemonade. I was into it. I do wonder though, maybe for me at least, it might be a little sensory overload, like the bubbles with the spice. I like both, but it could just be fear of the unknown.
The bubbles and the spice. That is the name of your next band.
The bubbles and the spice, the fear of the unknown. My next band.
That's the name of your first
name.
Yeah, the Bubbles and the Spice first album, The Fear of the Unknown. Do we have any housekeeping, Jess?
Oh, well, it's just a follow up on the reason I bring this up is because I got this definitely targeted email about a collaboration with Sanzo and Fly by Jing making a spicy sparkling water of yuzu and Sichuan pepper, which nails home exactly what you're talking about, Joey, with the citrus flavor plus the spice plus the sparkling.
Wow.
Could be overloading.
Yuzu
could be,
too.
Wow, just actually kind of sounds like interesting.
Yeah. It would have sounded funnier if it was kumquat and Szechuan pepper, but yuzu I think would taste better.
Yeah. I mean, we aren't sponsored by anything, but I think it wouldn't be crazy to have a nonsense sounding kumquat beverage to be our first sponsored beverage for Critical Nonsense.
Never say never.
Cool.
It
our
could
drink
happen.
Of choice is sparkling spicy kumquat drink.
It's just funny to say. I thought kumquats were made up until I was like 23 years old. I thought it was just like a thing.
Something about you.
Like people just say this word because it sounds funny. And then I had an ex-girlfriend's mom who was a chef, and she's like, "I made this like kumquat jam," and I was like, "What? You made an imaginary jam?" And she's like, "Kumquats aren't imaginary. It's a real fruit. It's a small citrus fruit." And I was like, yeah. Okay. Meanwhile, she made a kumquat jam and it was delicious. Anyways, first question, go. Final battle, fight.
That's you, right?
Yes, it is me. So I went to a concert recently, maybe like 2 or 3 weeks ago. First live show in years now. And it was like a friend of a friend came into town who I'm also like, pretty friendly with, and they invited me to come to this show. It was a Tame Impala show. I like Tame Impala. I had no idea like what the band or the person, which Harmand has filled me in, look like, or what the sort of crowd of people who like them are like, or anything like that. I just knew the music by itself. And so I went to the show, and it was a pretty awesome concert, right? Like, it was crazy, like laser light shows and super insane, like very psychedelic visuals. And what was wild to me was like, it was a proper rock and roll concert. And I think, we've heard for a long time, in a lot of sort of cultural critics or sort of people who write about music, that rock and roll is dead. And I think it's sort of like a thing I had just internalized because enough people said it, and it's not like a thing that I feel like I have a strong enough opinion about one way or another. But being there, it was at Barclays Center. The arena was jam-packed full, the second night of 3 nights of sold-out concerts. And all the people in the arena were like largely teens and early 20s, super diverse. And I was like, this is a rock show, and it is all young people, like a diverse scene. Like, rock and roll is not dead, but maybe it just looks different. And so my question for y'all is, how dead is rock and roll?
I don't think it's dead at all.
Hot take.
I was actually surprised to hear you say that there were a lot of teenagers there, because the way that Tame Impala was discovered was actually through MySpace. Like, he's been, around for a long time and like bouncing between bands. Like, there's another band called Pond that he used to play the drums for. And I think it's like 2 of the Pond members that play with him as Tame Impala now. I do think, I rember people saying the same thing about hip hop, right? It's like hip hop is dead. Like, it happens with like every like, pop culture dominant genre of music, and
yeah,
they say that. But I feel like what happens is like the radios kind of shift to like what else is new, but there's still like entire subcultures still creating content out there.
Well, and isn't this interesting? Because a few weeks ago, Dolly Parton rejected the honorific of being inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and was like, I guess, said that she's never made a rock and roll album, so it didn't feel right. But it's interesting to me to even think about what even is it to say it's dead.
Yeah, that is sort of increase. I've been thinking about it since I was at the show, and literally in my head as like people are going crazy, and I have like in front of me there was 4, I don't know, maybe 18-year-old women who are like going crazy, like got so done up to come out to the show, and behind me is like a group of early 20-somethings, and I was like, it was like the girls in front of me were white girls, the girls behind me were Hispanic girls. I had 2 Indian dudes next to me. Like, it was just of all, people of all like races and creeds. And I was just like, this is so cool. Like, this was not what like a rock show was like when I was growing up. And that idea of like, what is rock and roll, I think today, like genres are so much looser. If you think about Spotify has, I just looked it up just because I knew it was crazy, and it's even crazier than I thought it was. 5,071 distinct genres on Spotify that are based like on a number of things. And there have been articles written about the guy who does the genres on Spotify. But like that idea of if genres are blurring and the, categories maybe are less important, that's one thing. And so for me to even call it a rock and roll show may be wrong, but I was just like, this feels like it is people up on the stage who are really like largely just playing music. They're not necessarily entertaining with their performance of the music as much as they've built a show around them that is like awesome and interesting, and everyone is here just sort of like focused in on these few people playing the music. Like, I don't know, there was just something about it in my head was like, this is a rock and roll show, check. And like, it is certainly a vibe, check. And maybe it's not dead, but maybe even deciding like, there's so much genre bending now, right? Like you can think of, like hip hop acts that maybe are like hip hop as like a 1A category, but 1B sort of come into like indie rock and, or acid rap or things like that, where there's all these genres blending. And so maybe it's not even a question of whether like rock and roll is dead or alive. It's like all genres are dead.
That's really interesting to think about, like is it the instruments that we have like this attachment to, like I've never even considered, like the Smiths are rock, but so is Metallica, and so is Tame Impala. So it's like maybe we have these ties to like specific instruments and like their cultural history, maybe, and like when people see that, it's like they cue it, like, oh, okay, this is hip hop because a certain kind of music is playing, and like it's one guy with a microphone, or like this is rock because it's a guitar and a drummer behind him. Like that makes me wonder, like,
yeah, I mean, I'm curious, like for y'all, if you were to do a checklist, and I kind of want to hear you go first, Jess, just because I feel like you're not gonna have like a clearly defined answer in your head, and I think that's gonna be funny. Is like, how would you define rock and roll? Like, what makes a rock and roll act?
Rock and rolly.
Yeah, what makes rock and rolly?
All right, let's just do word association, right? A few things that come to mind. I would say leather, guitar licks, hair. These are very visual things. I mean, a guitar lick is not really, but I could just like imagine it. Grit, swagger, groupies.
What about sonically?
Sonically, I would say guitar licks again. And I would maybe yeah, that's interesting. You should chime in now.
Well, I want to hear Harmand.
I do agree. Like, I feel like a guitar needs to have some sort of presence. Like, I don't know about like, it's like if you are familiar with like guitars, like there's different pedals and each pedal does a different thing. You have like reverb, you have flangers, you have like overdrive, which brings like the classic like snarl that we all love on guitars. But like, I don't think it has to be like incredibly overdriven. Like, I think it could be soft or like not have drums. But I do kind of feel like, okay, like a guitar should be present for it to be rock.
Yeah.
But then that brings the question.
Go ahead.
But then that also makes me think of the question of like, what if it's like fully electric? What if it's using a DAW like Ableton or Fruity Loops? Like, is an electric guitar on a computer?
Yeah, that's the thing is like I think we had and I don't know if this holds true for a lot of other genres, right? I think like maybe like a jazz quartet as an example has like a set of instruments that are traditionally part of a jazz quartet, right? But I think because of how rock and roll came up and sort of like entered into the zeitgeist, of like mainstream mass media in like the 50s and 60s, you had sort of an expectation of like a 4-part band, right? Like a lead guitar, a rhythm guitar, a bass, and a set of drums. And obviously people sort of broke that a little bit here and there of like adding a keyboardist or, having even more guitars like the Eagles or something like that. But there was sort of like a conceptual image of it, which I think some of what you were talking about, Jess, was sort of like this visual representation of what a rock band was. Like the band itself was so much a part of the ethos of rock and roll music that even when you're thinking about something now, like, Tame Impala being an example that I didn't know ahead of this, I just assumed it was a band, but you were saying like it's one person who makes all the music, but then when he tours, he brings out friends and touring musicians and whatever that will play with him. But like, Gary Clark Jr. or St. Vincent, right? Like that is sort of like guitar led. They are very popular, but if you went like Tame Impala, Gary Clark Jr., St. Vincent, all have like radically different sounds in a way that maybe in earlier eras of rock and roll, there was like a little bit more sonic similarity in the different eras than maybe what we have now.
Also, I'm just looking at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame inductees, and already I am aware that everything I said earlier is even not just recently, but throughout history, seemingly a very narrow perception of what is, at least according to this single organization, a construct of rock and roll. Like I'm also seeing greats on this list.
You had like very 80s hair metal.
Totally. There's like Louis Armstrong, Aretha Franklin, Nat King Cole are on this list.
Yeah, that like one, like incredible musicians, but two, surprising. Yeah.
Well, so this is what I'm wondering. So I'm like, wait a minute, and had been inducted well over 20 years ago, each of them.
Wow.
So I guess now I'm thinking, what is this? I'm more confused now.
We had this, I mean, genres weren't new in like the 21st century. You always had different types of subgenres that existed, but they were like less prominent, I guess. So I don't think they were talked about, and they weren't certainly as fractured as 5,071 distinct musical genres according to Spotify. But like you had folk rock, i.e. Neil Young, Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, like that sort of place. You had sort of like the more like Americana, like 70s, like Free Rider, like the Eagles type of rock and roll. You had the Beatles going on. You had like Led Zeppelin. You had British rock, like the Rolling Stones. And that's just like quickly hitting a few where I'm not, probably even hitting the most interesting things that were being done. You had psychedelic rock in the 70s and things like that. But I think when like grunge happened and then indie rock kind of spun out of that initially as like literally like independent rock and roll, independent labels sort of initially, but then indie became sort of a sonic designation of the music. It felt like that was a moment where you started to have this like significant splintering of what it means to be rock and roll, where you wouldn't say, like early 2000s, like Death Cab for Cutie or bands like that were sort of indie darlings. But you would never sort of think about them in the same way that you would think about sort of Metallica or some of the bands that maybe sit a little bit closer to the traditional rock and roll genre. And so like part of me is like, this is a good thing, right? People are being more experimental with rock and roll, but like, does it even matter if like we call a thing rock and roll or not? I don't know. Like, it's cool to be able to have like interesting guitar music happening of like Gary Clark Jr. and St. Vincent and folks like that are doing cool shit. Or even like the XX, when I saw the XX live, and it's just two of them, like, you're not going to be able to see this, but they're just standing with their like legs spread, like completely backlit, and just like swaying, playing their guitars. And I was like, wait, is the XX a rock and roll band? Like, I remember thinking that when I saw them, and they're like, by any way that you spin it, probably not, but like also maybe.
That makes me think of like the early 2000s, like if you remember like any of those new metal bands, like
yes,
Limp Bizkit and Korn, where it was like
Chevelle
that rock was like, yeah, like heavily hip hop influenced, but it's like,
yeah,
is anyone gonna list like Fred Durst or like Jonathan Davis on like their top rapper list? Like that's interesting to think about. Like, what do these genres mean?
And like the new metal stuff was happening, and even at that point, right? Like rock, I brought up indie rock, but then you had new metal of like System of a Down that was produced by Rick Rubin. Their first album was produced by Rick Rubin, who was is a significant producer and had done like he was in the 99 Problems Jay-Z video. But you have a group of like Armenian refugees from LA who made a band that is like, he was just like, this sounds like nothing I've ever heard before, so I'm going to produce it. Right. Or like Disturbed or bands like that are doing like these big, like almost like operatic sounds in some songs. And then other ones are like just pure, like the new metal, like Let the Bodies Hit the Floor or whatever, like screaming and stuff. I mean, so maybe what we're saying is like rock and roll is alive and well and just looks nothing like it's ever looked like before. And I guess like I would just ask, like, does it matter? Is rock and roll like is it a significant enough concept that it's important to think about it as enduring in some capacity, or like does that matter, right? In the way that like hip hop is like very much enduring, and there is sort of like not a linearity but a connectedness through eras that you feel, even with the sort of wide range and experimental sounds. There's something where you're like, this is either like hip hop or not. Like when you hear a song, even if you're hearing like shoegaze mumble rap out of like the North Midwest, right? Like you're like, this is still hip hop. It sounds very different, but like they're making Dragon Ball Z references and shit like that, and you're like, still hip hop. And like, is it important for like rock and roll as an example of like a concept to endure, or other genres like classical music or something like that? I don't know.
I don't think so. Like that makes me think of when we go down like almost like popular lists of like greatest bands of all time, right? Like look at like Led Zeppelin or like Queen, and they weren't popular at first. Like Atlantic Records put a lot of money into Led Zeppelin on like getting them touring in Europe, and like they weren't successful at first. But then like you talk to anyone that plays a guitar and they know who Jimmy Page is. So it's like over time they're highly revered and like become this thing. But it's like in that era, other bands didn't sound like that. So it's like it took a minute to catch on. And it's probably the same thing we're experiencing now, like where people are just making music and just what they feel.
Yeah, I wonder even if genre is more useful in preservation than anything else, right? You talk about classical music or even rock and roll in this very narrow concept. It's useful if you want to make sure that that thing can persist into the future. It's like, well, these are all of the qualities and the makings, the trappings of that thing, so you know it. You have heard of it, or, we can pass it down. But in terms of expanding, creating new things, trampling the genres moving ahead, who cares?
Yeah, I do think it's interesting, like you were saying, like that the maintenance may be relevant as fuel for experimentation, because you're like, I like this band. What are other bands like it? I can look at a genre. I can find other things. I can sample something and create a new thing. And if there's sort of like a line, right? Like if you're a hip hop artist today, you can be like, they were doing these things in the 80s, and like Sugar Hill Gang came onto the scene, and then by the 90s hip hop was moving in this direction, and all you can sort of like follow the like arc through time and genre bending. And like rock and roll, I think, was able to do that for a while, and like the genres just became different and the lifestyles became so different that it wasn't, but like the ability to say like whatever, Tame Impala and Gary Clark Jr. and Vampire Weekend or something are like all rock and roll bands because they were influenced by bands that sort of you might categorize as at the highest order level rock and roll, right? And so maybe it's just like the categories of like rock and roll versus hip hop versus classical music, whatever, are these like higher order categories that don't mean much by themselves, but if you go into the sub layers, they start to gain more meaning. Jess, do you want to do our musical wrap up? Oh, real quick, at some point, I do want to talk about the concept of Baroque Pop, just because I find it so fascinating and I don't know who created it. Like, but they say that the Beach Boys' Pet Sounds album was the first Baroque Pop album, and they have like this like family tree of influences of that Pet Sounds album on Baroque Pop and all the sounds that sort of came out of it. And I just find it fascinating that someone's like, this is Baroque Pop and this is what was birthed out of it. Anyways, Jess's wrap-up corner.
I don't know how I'm supposed to respond to that. But
if it ain't Baroque, don't fix it.
How dead is rock and roll? I don't know. Put a dime in it. Not the song, but I'm making up a song. Moving on to the next topic.
Rock and roll. Is Tenacious D rock and roll? I think so, right? Yeah. Just because it's funny doesn't mean it doesn't rock. Anyways.
Jack Black, School of Rock film circa early 2000s?
Yeah, maybe early mid.
Mm-hmm.
You're tacky and I hate you. Where is that kid today?
I've never seen it.
You're a fat loser and you have body odor. That's two lines from the movie that are permanently burnt into my head. Harmand, Mr. Ponder, what do you have for us?
Yeah, I've been doing a lot of thinking around identity, and mostly on a genetic level. Like, I recently did a 23andMe test, and when I got the results back, I won't say they were shocking. Like, I have always identified like as a Black American, but the mix within was definitely like what was surprising to me. And it just made me think of, how many different like cultures and between like language, religion, and even family structures, a career, like, are we tied to our genetic identity?
How are we tied to our genetic identity? I like, I'm so much more interested in the individual stories, and maybe this is because like my genetic identity is like just, I've never actually done the testing, although my parents did one recently, and there were like, I mean, pseudo surprising things, I guess, insofar as like my dad was 40% Iberian, right? Like, which is never part of any of the family's story, right? Like everyone in my dad's side is just like, we're French Canadian. I don't know. And it's like, on my mom's side, it was always just like a bunch of like immigrants in like the late 1800s, early 1900s, like German and Irish and like English, French, whatever. It's just sort of like a Midwestern mix of like white Euro immigrants. So I never really, it didn't feel like there was a story, but in sort of like the individual family story, someone had shared something at some point with us that was like trying to do like, before ancestry.com and whatever, they reached out to my dad and were like, we have the same last name. I'm doing like our family tree across anyone I can find on Facebook and trying to slot in. And so they shared a bunch of things with us once they like slotted us into the map that they were building. And it was like, my family was, you know, some however many greats grandfather was like kicked out of France for salt smuggling when they were trying to populate New France in like Eastern Canada. And so they like increased the penalties on all these like petty crimes to where it's like do 5 years in jail or go to the colony. And so whichever many greats this grandfather was like, cool, I'll go to the colony. And so like those like stories are interesting more so than being like, you know, someone was born in this part of the world, you know, of these mountains or these plains or whatever. But it might just be because I have like a boring genetic identity or something, you know.
Well, this is what I want to ask, Harmand. What about receiving these results shifted things for you? Why did those things on paper stir anything?
I think for me, it's like opening my mind. It kind of like, it's almost as if like, okay, like I don't know anything about like West or East Africa. Like I lived in England for almost 8 years. So the 30% of that was like English, was like, okay, cool. But like, these are two cultures I don't really know anything about. And yet this is what makes me who I am. And it kind of just had me thinking about like how we take in general, like I feel like us as humans, we take like these things and we make them linear, but in reality, they all exist on spectrums, you know? And I like that the point that Joey brought up, because to me, it kind of feels like the opposite end, right? Like of the spectrum, it's like on one end, you have like, my lineage has always been this one thing. So what does this even mean? And then you have like on my end, it's like, oh, my lineage is like mixed with all these things. So what does this even mean? Like, you know, like it's like two sides of the same coin.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting too, to think about like even the construct of saying like you are 30% English, right? Is like, I mean, all of this is social constructs, right? And thinking about like, it just happens that someone along at some point in the path was in England or like shares a certain amount with English people. And whereas cultural identity is so much more interesting, but it gets blurry, right? Particularly when you have like immigrants to new countries recently in your family's history, where there is this sort of blend of like cultural identities that's happening, right? Like, I didn't, my grandparents spoke French Canadian, and so like I saw it a little bit, but someone who is first generation American or mixed race and first generation on one half is sitting in this place where you have like, you were born in America, so you probably just based on the sort of culture that exists outside of your home have a bunch of sort of regional American identity that just as a product of being in a place. But then that like your culture is of, some other place in the world that exists, and how tied should you be? And I think we often somehow are like, well, I came, my family is French, or my family is Ghanaian, or my family is, Chinese, or whatever it is. And there's sort of like a pull to be like, the cultural identity is somehow tied to the genetic identity. I think we sort of like mix those things together and feel like if I have this sort of like phenotypical or like morphological identity, because you can sort of see like you said in your case, like I am a Black American, then like what does it mean to be like specifically Ghanaian or Nigerian or like Cote d'Ivoire or wherever in sort of West and East Africa, or Kenyan, Eritrean, like if you've never been, and like how do you reconcile those aspects of things,
especially if they're being read on you. This is something that is funny.
Yeah, exactly.
Ryan and me walking around Chinatown, and Ryan looks pretty Chinese and I look confusing, and people will approach him speaking Chinese, and he'll look to me and he'll be like, did you get it? Because I am I don't know if this is a correct way to put it, but like I'm more culturally Chinese than Ryan is, even though he looks way more Chinese than me. And it's really interesting because like that's genetic showing, but has nothing to do with how tethered we are to that part of our history.
Yeah. That's interesting too to think about, because like, even when Joey repeated it back just now, like a Black American, it's like, I mean, my passport, like birth certificate, everything says I'm American, but I mean, like for half of my life, like I'm 30 now, and for literally half of my life, I was in Europe, so it's like, I remember like being in middle school and like coming back to the States, like about to go to high school. And I had a friend his family was Italian American, like maybe like third gen. And I remember like telling my mother this story, like after staying at his house one weekend, about like how his mom like broke the pasta, and like she, like all the things that she did that like in Napoli you would never do, like it's a sin. But that was, like it's like, that's interesting to think about, like culturally versus, genetically. What is the difference? And like, like I was in England for 8 years. Like, can I say that I'm English? Like, or what does that even mean for me to be like,
Yeah, like, well, apparently you can say you're 30% genetically English, but for sure you like to live somewhere for 8 years in like formative years. Like there are parts of your cultural identity that would, right, like, whether it's taste or like language or like, social mannerisms that invariably come from those things. I think like, being married to someone who is like first generation, but also like a New Yorker, like for Becky, it is like, I don't know how she would rank her identities, but like, in interacting with her, she is like a New Yorker first and foremost, like her vibe, and like she is, a Queens kid, like through and through. And then like also obviously like, you know, the child of immigrants is part of her identity. And being in New York, you can be very sort of integrated into like traditional Chinese culture also. And so you like, if you like the idea that you brought up, Jess, of like, what is your identity based on what people like grok on you? Like do you look X culture? Do you look Y culture or whatever it is? And sort of the expectations that come with that, I think is really interesting.
You know, that makes me think about how anytime I go uptown, like I have most of my family's from like the Harlem area, and I have a cousin that's like in the Heights, like in Washington Heights, and every time I'm there, people just automatically assume like, oh, he's Dominican, you know, like, and I don't have any, you know, like Spanish in my family, but you know, it's like there's a lot of like predispositions that's interesting to hear.
Sure. Context clues. There you go. You put two and two together. Yeah. And also, regardless of whether someone needs to rank order their identities, I think it's
need to.
It's more the idea that what maybe on paper or for all intents and purposes seems to be like the objective outlining of one's identity is not matched per se to one's own sense of it, or you have a different equation in your head maybe than what out there would say about you.
I mean, the funny part about this too is sort of like when you start to get into like epigenetic identity and things like that, and like the expression of your own. So epigenetics is basically the like selective expression based on environmental or context signals that sort of express your individual genome in different reasons because of what it's exposed to. And so, right, like if you had an identical twin that, you know, in this like counterfactual like thought experiment,
it's nurture of nature and nurture kind of.
It's nurture of nature. It's like if you had a identical twin that was raised in like a different environment, right? Like you grew up in Pennsylvania and your identical twin grew up in like Rio, right? Like the warm environment, the different diet, the different exposure to environmental factors would potentially express the identical genes that you have in different ways. And we're like increasingly learning a lot about that. And so like in so many ways, you add on the place too, where the place matters, even if it's not sort of like your people in quotes are from that place. If you are from that place, the environment will change the ways in which your genome expresses. And so like thinking about that, right? Because I was thinking about like, I grew up in the woods in New Hampshire. I mean, like a city, but like mostly spending my time in the forest. And like so much of that, I feel like is more part of like my concept of my identity than like anything else. Like just being like an outdoor kid, latchkey kid, like playing in the forest and lighting fires, I feel like is more of my identity than like anything else.
You know, I have a hot take.
All right, let's go.
My hot take of the week, possibly month, is I'm not a fan of beaches. I don't care too much for beaches. Like
definitely not
being
Dominican.
Near it is okay. Yeah. You know, I'm in a group chat with a bunch of friends, and they were roasting me last week for that. Like, but when you brought that up, like my upbringing, it's like I've always been in walking distance to a train. Like, you know, like I've always been close to like public transportation and like used to noise and things like that. So maybe it's the fact that, okay, I can either swim or like sit in the sun and that's it. Like I want to like, I don't know, maybe I want to walk around or go to a deli or something. I don't know.
Where's the deli in this ocean? I don't understand.
There's no Wi-Fi.
There's just nothing here.
I think this brings. The one thing I was going to say.
Fine. We'll just keep doing this.
Yeah.
Jess, psych.
Psych.
Wait, I was about to say it's your turn. It's not.
I think if you get a chance on the back of this, and we can share some of the links, like what you had said reminded me so much of the Henry Louis Gates stuff when he was doing. I think the name of the show is called. Hold on. Finding Your Roots. He's a professor at Harvard of like, I think of history and a number of things. And he started doing this show around like genealogy and family history and ancestry on PBS. And as part of doing the show, I think he may have done his first or at some point did his, and they did like genetic testing and stuff like that. And it came back like his family story, he was in his 50s, I think, when this happened, but his family had like a story of like, being Black Americans and coming out of slavery and having like Native American roots and things like that in it. And they did the genetic test, and he was half like European and half Black, half, wow. A mix of African regions, I think West African. But he called his mom to talk to her about it, and he tells a story. He's told it in different interviews and things like that. And he called her and he was like, I did the test. He talked to his brother, and his brother was like kind of mad, but he talked to his mom, and his mom was like, I think she said something like, baby, I'm too old to be anything different. And she was just like, my sort of cultural identity and the story that I've told myself into like her 70s or 80s at that point, like she didn't need to tell a different story based on like what the genetic profile was gonna say, because the story that she had lived in her experience and the stories that her family had told her were like too much in conflict. And it's interesting to think about, like, even just being able to choose and say like, actually, like my like lived experience and my sort of cultural stories and heritage that, is sort of like folk heritage is more important, and just like leaning into that, I think, is kind of cool. So Jess's wrap-up corner.
I don't know.
Jess's genealogy corner.
The moment has passed. I think it's interesting that this type of thinking, this, something as simple as a genetic test, a very casual thing. But it wouldn't necessarily even have to be that, just some kind of realization about one's history and how it can put into question how you conceive of yourself, or even offer up the opportunity to decide if you want to think differently about it or not. And what are some of the other factors that contribute to, what makes us us outside of that, since there are plenty. It's just your casual Friday afternoon chit chat. We love it, Harmand.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This was fun.
You want a fun fact?
Yeah.
Let's hear it.
I don't know that it's like, it's probably like a broadly known fun fact, but there's more genetic diversity in Africa than there is everywhere else in the planet combined. Because,
wow.
When we look at diversity today and the way that we have conversations about it, often we're just talking about sort of phenotypical, like the visual expression of genes, or like morphological, but like
words.
Some of the
regular words.
What color and shape are people? but like some of the shortest people in the world come from different parts of Africa. Some of the tallest people in the world come from different parts of Africa. Like, you know, different expressions based on altitude, because humanity developed for so long in Africa before, you know, the sort of diaspora out of Africa is like relatively short compared to the length of the development of Homo sapiens, that like the genetic variety within people of Africa are so different. But when we only think about things in terms of like race or like phenotypical expression, right? Like, what do you look like? Are you tall? Are you skinny? Are you short? Are you heavy? Like, are you muscular? Or are you not? Whatever. And I always find it like fascinating just to show like how wrong so many of like the social constructs that we build around this stuff are.
Wow.
Fun fact.
Wow. Cool.
Well,
Thanks, Joey, for that. So fun.
you said thanks, Joey, but I heard fuck off, Joey.
Fun facts. Harmand doesn't like the beach. Wow.
Critical Nonsense is a Sylvain production.
Brought to you by Kumquats. That's it.
As always, we'd like to thank you, executive producer and citrus fiend Jess Vander, as well as our special guest and neurodivergent brethren, Harmand Ponder.
I am also here to thank 5,000 and more genres, but also sound engineer Alex Contel.
We'd like to thank our programming coordinator and cultural king, Les Jacobs.
And to thank our production help, but also some other words. Sorry, Gilbert. Sorry, Gilbert and Nora Mestridge. Well, that's what it'll have to be for now.
Our production help and honorific. And as always, thanks, Ellen.
Sorry, Len.
Special thanks.
Special thanks.
Elden Ring? Do we thank Elden Ring, Harmand?
Still no idea what this is.
Definitely. Considering both the genres we covered, we definitely have to thank Elden Ring. You can be anything you want in there.
You can be anything you want. You can literally be blue if you want. I mean, at the end of the day, isn't that what we all want? Just to be blue? Or is that... No, that's just me? Okay, got it. Check.
I would like to thank blue flavored candies, which isn't a flavor I know, but just like bear with me for a second, for being willing to persist through life so that one day when I was old enough to make this choice, I was able to see what the fuss was all about of having something that would stain your teeth and your tongue blue, because I was never allowed it as a child. And, you know, it was just good to have that experience later. So there you go.
I want to thank you all. Like the entire Critical Nonsense team. This is a really dope idea. It's kind of bizarre. I listened to a Kanye episode that you did like years ago before you were working here, and now I'm on an episode. But Jess, Alex, Joey, you guys are amazing. And I also want to thank my dad, because that DNA kit was just sitting on my desk and he kept asking me about it. And I'm like, okay, let me do it now. Which led us to today. So.
I want to thank your dad. Okay, Joey.
I want to thank you. I was going to say, like, thank you, Dad, for making me take the test and also giving me an existential crisis. What are dads good for if not just like the occasional existential crisis, really? Like, that's what I aspire to. Like, Emerson, be prepared. You're going to get an existential crisis from me someday. Just be ready for it. I'm waiting in the wings, biding my time. Just come in, drop something.
Alarming. We're not saying that about you, Mr. Ponder. We appreciate you and your inspiration.
All right. Well, That's the gratitude corner.
That's it, I guess.
Thank
Today's an
you.
awkward
Bye.
day. Okay, bye.
Love you.
Bye.
I don't know why I always get the fucking Carpenters song stuck in my head before we start the episode. Like,
Maybe it's sort of a
why?
trigger thing. Maybe
Yeah.
it's just your...
I'm just like, don't you remember you told me you love me, baby? Like that just comes into my fucking head. every
You've sung this song to intro
Yeah.
episodes. It must
Yeah.
be.
Like I don't know what. Like I have no idea.